Hey everybody, I'm Rick Beato. Today's Everything Music. We're going to talk about 5 tips to improve your bass playing. It's really anybody from beginner to advanced this applies to. You guys see me play guitar and keyboards a lot in my videos, but I was actually a bass player before any of that, and my undergraduate degree is in bass, classical bass. That's what I played from the time I was a kid all the way through my undergraduate degree. Tip number 1. Sometimes the best thing to do is to lay out on the bass. Here's a great example of bringing the bass in and out for dramatic effect. This is a tune called Leavenway by an artist named Owen Beverly, and the bass player is Les Hall, who you've seen on my channel. I produced this track and mixed it, 17 years ago. Let's check it out.
Stop counting cards. Look up, drive the car for the both of us. Could you please?
So just to reiterate, the bass is the harmonic foundation and the tonal foundation for the entire mix. So when it drops out, you notice it, but when it comes back in, it makes a huge difference. So use space in your bass lines. Tip number 2, don't just play the root. You have the 3rd and the 5th of your chord that are also great notes for the bass. One thing to note, if you have the 3rd in your melody and you're playing the 3rd in the bass, it weakens the melody. Make sure if your singer is singing the 3rd that you're not playing the 3rd on the bass. Right? You don't want to have that doubled 3rd in the chord. It really weakens the sound of that voicing. You can use your 3rds when the singer is singing the root or the 5th. If the singer is singing the 5th and you're playing the 5th, it's not as powerful either. I try to avoid the notes that the singer is singing, so you don't have those parallel octaves between the outer parts of the melody and the bass line. Let me give you an example of what inversions sound like on the bass. 2, 3, 4. Tip number 3 is it's just as important where you play, meaning between here and here, as it is whether you play with fingers or a pick. As a producer, I've recorded many different kinds of basses. You can see I have Rickenbacker bass, I have a P bass, I have a jazz bass, I have an Ernie Ball bass, and I have multiple bass amps. I have this dark glass amp here, I have a SVT way in the back here. So I'm a big believer on having the right instrument for the right tone. Also, I'm a believer in being able to play with your fingers or a pick, because that is about tone as well. If you play close to the bridge, you're going to get a much more mid-rangey tone that jumps out and is better for single note playing or solos than if you play up here where you get a mellower, fatter tone with more low end. Or if you're playing in a high register so that you have more string length to use. If I play up here, the note is much thinner because there's less distance for the string to ring as opposed to here. Sounds thin, right? That sounds fatter. You will notice if you look at this clip of Jocko, he's playing in different areas of the bass to get different sounds. If you play with a pick, it works the same way. If you play by the bridge, very mid-rangey, and as you get closer to the neck, you hear more low end and you hear a rounder sound. So you hear it gets thinner there, right? Tip number 4, mute the strings that you're not playing. If I'm playing the note C here, this string is being muted by my index finger. This string is being muted, and so is that by this index finger, just by the angle of it. It's extremely important to do your muting with this hand whenever you can. You don't want extraneous bass notes ringing out because it muddies the entire mix. And many times you'll think, wow, why does that sound really bad? When I would be producing a record, I'd say, but what's going on the bass there? It sounds like like a couple strings ringing together. And it typically was. And that's pretty much a game changer. A person cannot make a record if you can't mute properly, because playing cleanly on the bass and only hearing one note at a time, if that's what you're meaning to do. Now, many people will play chords, but even if I'm playing a chord, that chord, I'm still muting that string. Tip number 4, learn the tools in your toolbox for bass tone, meaning your DI sound, your amp sound, compression, EQ points, all really important. Okay, so there are many great plugins made for bass. You have the Dark Glass Electronics plugins that are fantastic. They also have great pedals. You have things like SansAmp. You have a lot of different guitar plugins you can put your bass through. You can split your signal up into multiple bass tracks and distort maybe the top end and the mid-range, but not the low end. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. You don't have to use a standard amplifier. You can mic your amplifier. But some of the general rules about EQ and compression. The top end of the bass, or the area of the bass EQ-wise where it speaks, one of the areas is about 1.56K, right in that range. 2K at the top end. That's where your top end, your brightness of your bass is. You also have an area around 800 hertz where the bass will also speak. That's your mid-range point. Then down low, you'll get your bass extension, 60 hertz, 50 hertz, like that gives you that really big foundation. But there's another spot around 300 hertz that will enable you to hear your instrument, your bass, on very small speakers, like your phone, your iPhone, your Android, whatever. That's about 300 hertz. That's where you start to hear it. If you use an EQ and you put it through a little tiny radio speaker, right, and start moving up an EQ bump, you'll notice it around 300 hertz or so, that's where you'll begin to hear it. The other way to begin to hear your bass when it's getting lost in a mix or on small speakers is by adding distortion to it. Any type of distortion gives the bass more harmonic information and helps it to be heard through a dense layer of guitars, or it doesn't even have to be a lot of distortion. Just having the amp with a slight bit of overdrive will make it pop out of the mix by giving it the right mids that it needs. The thing about using just a straight, clean DI, you tend to have a sound that's kind of hollowed out in the mid-range and doesn't quite speak. You'll have good bottom end, especially if you have new strings. You have a lot of bottom end, a lot of top end. As your strings get older, they start to lose bottom end, they start to lose top end, and they have a more consistent mid-range. And there's some people that never change their strings on their bass. I know a lot of producers that have basses that they never change them because they like that sound. It gives it a consistency. The other thing is using a compressor. What a compressor does is that it evens out the bass. Now, I was just talking about how when the bass drops out, it makes a big difference because that's one of the things you can hear. Just like at a gig, if you play a wrong note and you're the bass player, everybody hears it. If you're a guitar player and you play a wrong note, most people don't even notice. But when a bass player makes a mistake, it's a big mistake. Having a consistent low end, using compression with the correct attack and release time. You want a release time if you're holding notes. You want a release time that holds out long enough where that note doesn't have a sharp transient and then a quick envelope down, where it has the sharp transient and then it comes down with a more gradual slope to keep the low end consistent in your mix. Tip number 5, your pocket is the most important thing about your playing, meaning where do you play in relation to the groove? I always found that bass players that would play slightly behind the kick drum would make the low end sound huge. I would always listen to sessions and be like, man, bass sounds huge in this. Why is that? It always would be that the bass would be slightly behind the kick drum, and it would just give that huge, huge low end. But you should be able to play on top of the beat, behind the beat, ahead of the beat. Know what works for the particular song you're playing. Your pocket is the most important thing about your bass playing. That's all for now. Please subscribe here to my Everything Music YouTube channel. If you're interested in the Beato book, go to my website at www.rickbeato.com. Follow me on Instagram at rickbeato1. Definitely do that. Check out the new Beato ear training program. If you go to beatoeartraining.com, watch the introduction video. And if you want to support the channel even more, think about becoming a member of the Beato Club. And once again, thank you all for watching.